folks. My name is Isabel Santis, and I'm the director of Spiral Journey Integration. And it is my great pleasure to welcome today to our inaugural episode of our new podcast, Phillip Scott, Chief Shunkan Wankan Sapa. I am so sorry if I pronounced that incorrectly, Phillip, but it is my great pleasure to welcome Phillip to talk to us today. And I had the great pleasure of meeting Phillip. It's going to be about 12, 15 years ago at a class at CIS where he was teaching about Indigenous lifeways and Indigenous medicine. And Chief Phillip has been working and walking the Native path for over 40 years. He has been learning and adopted and sanctioned by Indigenous Medicine and Holy people and tribal spiritual leaders and wisdom keepers and elders from several nations and cultures. He does the sun dance every year in the Lakota tradition, and for 3 decades, he has been a respected member of the Native medicine families. He's a ceremonial leader and traditional healer, entrusted to share Indigenous wisdom, knowledge, and medicine ways with the contemporary world. He serves as a bridge, and he's a staunch defender and advocate for Indigenous rights and environmental justice. He's an advisor and presenter on various sacred matters, and a counselor, educator, and consultant for academic, spiritual, religious, medical, environmental, and penal institutions, as well as for corporations. He is a contributing author to Stanley Krippner's The Shamanic Powers of Rolling Thunder, as well as Itzhak Berry's Shamanic Transformations. In addition to directing and teaching at Ancestral Voice Institute for Indigenous Lifeways in Northern California, which he founded in 1944, he maintains a healing practice and performs traditional ceremonies and conducts intensive lectures and leads pilgrimages worldwide. It is such a great pleasure to have you here, Phillip. Thank you for accepting this invitation, and I would love to start this conversation that we've been knocking around now. And the reason why I wanted to bring you on today was I really wanted to talk about something that's been very near and dear to my heart. And that is for those of us who are walking or attempting to walk it with integrity, the medicine path, we often lack the spiritual direction of elders in the space. And I wanted to bring you on because you have certainly provided that role. You did provide that role at a very important part of my journey. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to see if you could talk a little bit about the importance of spiritual direction and listening to our elders in the way that we do the work today.
Well, thank you, Isabel, for the invitation to be the inaugural guest on your podcast. And I thank you for also your inquiry and this most important question as well as exploration that is quite relevant for the psychedelic therapeutic community at this time. So, being a traditionalist, I could never imagine partaking and certainly conducting ceremonies, any kind of ceremonies, either with or without sacraments, without proper training, tutelage, and education in the presence of traditional medicine people. And I see this this phenomenon occurring in terms of the rapidity with which psychedelics, as they're called by the Western world, but as I prefer to call as sacraments, this, shall we say, driving urgency that's regarded as a renaissance, which for Indigenous peoples is not a renaissance at all, because it's been so woven into the matrix of their lives, and that they've cultivated this abiding relationship with sacraments and the ceremonies that accompany them for literally millennia. And so consequently, there is, shall we say, some short circuiting going on, as far as in my estimation. right? So in order for a practitioner of traditional medicine person to be qualified often requires 10 or more years of apprenticeship to receive the proper training, tutelage, very rigorous ceremonial protocols that accompany the administration of sacraments. And so I think it's important for your listeners and for the world at large to ensure that there's an inclusivity for Indigenous voices and practices to be respected, as well as to be incorporated in a, shall we say, a rapport, or a relationship that is often lacking or is being dismissed. And so, for myself personally, I had been involved with Native medicine families for over 15 years before I was granted permission to conduct any kind of ceremony with the sacrament. And so part of the medicine path involves the cultivation of patience and also the capacity to surrender to one's mentors, to be able to learn the very sophisticated ceremonial protocols that accompany the administration of the medicine. There are specific songs, there are certain ritual enactments, there's also very elaborate procedures that can only be embodied and absorbed through direct participation over a significant duration of time.
Mhm. Mhm. And I think that one of the challenges that we have been seeing is that a lot of the training that is being done today for people to help facilitators become capable of serving medicines is devoid and divorced of this Indigenous influence and this capacity to directly explore and be present and absorb this training directly from someone that has been doing it for a very long time. As you are perfectly aware, the majority of training programs don't even allow participants to partake of the medicine because most of the training programs are held in countries where these medicines are illegal. So the opportunity to practice with the medicine and to observe the ceremony being done is it's not even part of the training. So I feel that oftentimes this capacity to understand and learn from Indigenous elders is not even a possibility for the majority of people. I don't know if you have any, of course, we're not going to solve that problem here right now. But I'm curious, what are your thoughts about that? And how can people engage respectfully and learn from elders on how to practice with this medicine from the people that have been holding the tradition for hundreds, if not thousands of years, rather from the Western psychology tradition that has been doing this work for the last 50, say?
Excellent question. So I encourage people to cultivate what I call turtle medicine. We have to slow down. We're moving way too fast, right? And observing pretty much from the outside, by attending some of these psychedelic therapy conferences, that many organizations are kind of flying by the seat of their pants. They're kind of trying to make it up as they go along, right? And for me, this is very dangerous and short-sighted, right? Because these are plant medicines, right? It's a medicine way. So the first part of your inquiry or observation is that it's one thing to have a theoretical construct. It's another to have an embodied experience. As far as I'm concerned, if it is true that individuals are learning how to apply these psychedelics within that framework or sacraments without directly experiencing it first themselves, then that's being out of integrity, right? You're not walking your talk, right? Which is a violation within Native country, right? So you cannot really articulate one's own direct truth if you never experience it yourself. So otherwise it becomes, shall we say, armchair psychedelic therapy, right? And to answer the second portion of your question, more than ever in the world right now, due to the urgency of the times that we have, Indigenous peoples have been sharing their knowledge and their practices with the Western contemporary world. It's actually an act of tremendous generosity and forgiveness, considering the heinous crimes that have been committed by colonizers in relationship to Indigenous peoples. And yet, through their medicine ways, through their ceremonies, and through understanding the essential catastrophe, right, this global issues, in many ways that we're finding ourselves in, many elders from several different cultures have been openly sharing their ways. So what's also required for the Western mind is humility, right? Rather than the perception of entitlement and privilege, to humble oneself, as I mentioned earlier, to surrender to one's mentors, right? To be able to learn these ways. So there is availability. And there are other individuals like myself who have been properly trained and qualified by traditional elders and medicine people to be able to conduct these ceremonies, right? At the same time, what's important is the understanding that there's no guarantee, right? That just because you participate in the Indigenous way of life, ceremonially speaking, by because for Indigenous peoples, these ceremonies are by invitation only.
Mhm.
If you receive the gift of an invitation, it doesn't automatically mean that you're going to be administering this medicine down the road. There's so many other circumstances, right? To receive the blessing and the sanction of your medicine teachers, again, is going to require years of discipline and devotion, because the most important thing is the relationship that you cultivate with that sacrament. And so if you haven't directly cultivated that relationship, then you're not going to be able to effectively serve another individual or a group of individuals. And so this is what I see as the delicate dance right now. And all that, from all of my colleagues and all the Indigenous people that I've spoken to, and I have observed also in their treatment at particular conferences, is the desire to be included in the conversation, which is often not lacking, right? And I think it's also important for the listeners, particularly those within the psychedelic therapeutic community, to comprehend the tremendous sacrifices that Indigenous peoples have made, not only to protect their ways of life and their culture, but the sacraments themselves. And so one of the conversations that I often hear that has not really established any traction yet is reciprocity,
Mhm.
right? So there's a buzzword about reciprocity, but its enactment remains to be seen, right? And it's not just about financial reciprocity, right? The Western strategy is often to throw money at things, right? And somehow that will suffice, right? But part of that reciprocity is also that inclusivity, that respect for Indigenous peoples and the sacrifices they've made, and those that are literally putting their lives on the line to protect these medicines. Right? Because many of these medicines are now being over-harvested because of this incessant consumption that you've been speaking of, and the commodification of them as well. The extreme prices that people are paying to participate in these therapeutic contexts. Whereas there's nothing that is being returned to the indigenous peoples for the sacrifices they've made, the protections of this medicine, right? But that reciprocity also goes deeper, Isabel, which has to do, and I often speak about this, the reciprocity in terms of the plant medicines themselves. Because if you don't have that relationship, then you can't understand the necessity for protecting the medicine. So part of that reciprocity is ensuring that future generations can also benefit from this medicine. So it's not about incessant consumption and commodification, but are there the alliance with indigenous peoples, for example, to ensure that there's the conservation of this medicine for future generations, right? So this conversation is not just about supporting indigenous peoples in their struggle for their ways of life in terms of their relationship to sacraments, but also the sacraments themselves.
Yes,
And I think it's critical for the psychedelic community to be cognizant of this and to begin to take action, right, in very pragmatic ways to protect the medicines as well as to ensure indigenous peoples are respected and have a voice at the table, as well as the humility to have them collaborate, right? So for me, it's not about integrative medicine, right? Or alternative medicine, because alternative, if you look at the root of the word, it's altering the native, and we don't need to alter the native, right? The indigenous medicine way has been efficacious and potent for literally millennia or thousands of years. So again, there's just respect around these ceremonial ways. And in time, through one's direct participation with bona fide traditional indigenous medicine people, there may be that possibility to be able to administer it in the future. Because what's essential, and this is also another important point, is about container, right? About the sacredness of a container. So if a practitioner doesn't have a relationship with the medicine, therefore cannot listen to the medicine, because the medicine is a wise elder and teacher and guide, and it's the medicine that creates the container along with the invocation of the ancestors and the spirits that hold the space. So the facilitator isn't holding the space, it's the ancestors whom they invoke as well as the spirit of the medicine directly.
Yeah.
So if that facilitator doesn't have a relationship with that medicine, then they're not able to listen, right, on how to effectively serve the people that are present, right? So that's another important piece. And of course, I also see the difference because another buzzword I hear is integration, right? Also seems to be an important part of the process. But I can say that for indigenous peoples that have this abiding relationship with the plant medicines, no integration is necessary because it's woven into the matrix of their life. It is literally a way of life. And so oftentimes for the Western colonized mind, they have a profound experience that alters their awareness, and it's often outside of the fabric of their ordinary life. And that's why the integration or the transition from that ceremonial space requires that gentleness and ease, right, to help them absorb as well as integrate all of the medicine, all of the teachings and the learnings that were imparted to them by participating in that ceremony. And what I say, because essentially all ceremonies are about prayer, right? It's about intent, right? So to participate in a ceremony requires intent. And so that intent is in the form of a prayer. And so after the ceremony is complete, I say it's necessary for us to put moccasins on our prayers. We have to walk the prayers right, that we have articulated in the ceremony, as well as to embody the teachings that were imparted from that elder, meaning that plant medicine. Oftentimes I hear that people are jumping from one ceremony to another, right? They're doing ayahuasca this weekend. They're doing, a peyote ceremony the next. They're doing iboga, etc. What I can say for indigenous peoples as well, and this also ties in with sustainability, is that we're not doing plant medicines all the time. It's not a panacea, which is often what I see happening in the psychedelic therapeutic community, right? But rather, it is a support, right? It is like a wise teacher, an elder, and mentor. And so to participate in repeated ceremonies incessantly without taking the time to integrate the medicine is not only disrespectful to the medicine, but disrespectful to indigenous people as well, right? Because it's a measured approach. When we receive these generous teachings in medicine from these wise, generous elders, it's incumbent upon us to walk that medicine in the world and to integrate the counsel. Because if we go back too prematurely, sometimes the plant medicines will say, did you follow the instructions? Right? And if you haven't done that, then it can become very challenging for you, right? Because you're disrespecting the medicine, right? And the chances are they may not even give you any more medicine until you've completed the directives that they have already imparted.
Yeah, I think you're speaking, I resonate so deeply with the work, with your words, the work that I specialize is integration. And it's, as you say, putting moccasins on the teachings, how are you going to implement these instructions, these ways that you've been shown into your daily life, and different patterns of action, different patterns of thought, of reaction, and all of these new ways of manifesting these new ways of being, so that you can become a better person, and then you can go back to the medicine for more. But it's not until you're done your homework. So
Exactly.
yeah, I deeply resonate with that. Tell me a little bit about building a relationship with the medicine. I oftentimes find that, and I recognize that my perspective has been shaped by people like you for some time. And although a lot of my training is in the Western world, but I feel that oftentimes we have this view, not we necessarily, but the Western world has this view of psychedelics as tools. Whereas in indigenous ways of thinking and cosmologies, they're trusted elders and allies that have wisdom to impart. And this views, one is an objectification of the medicine as a tool, something that we use, which to me harkens back to colonialism and the way in which we exploit and extract resources and knowledge for personal gain and profit, versus an alliance and collaboration with these wise elders that know so much more that we do about so much. So talk to me about that for a little bit.
I think that you articulated that very eloquently. I mean, the reality is that the approach to the Western model is still based on a scientific paradigm that's objectified, right? Rather than the intimate cultivation of a relationship, right? And not even so much as I've heard the term co-creative. It's like, it's not co-creative because these plant medicines are much older than ourselves. And so again, it's that wise elder that's imparting very strong directives that it is essential for us to receive, and embody by walking in the world. So it's not even so much even a collaboration per se, because a collaboration is kind of like on equal footing, right? But what I teach is that, if we look at the origin stories of all human beings from all cultures, human beings were the last to be created, not the first. Therefore, we're the youngest on the planet. We are the grandchildren. And for indigenous cultures, there's a deep reverence and respect for our elders, right? And so within the elements of a ceremony, earth, air, fire, water, the most ancient elders on the planet are present. All the ceremonies that indigenous peoples do involve those ancient elementals who are our eldest teachers on this planet, right? And next come the viruses and the bacteria, right? In terms of how life has evolved on this planet, right? The viruses and the bacteria and the mycelial network. Those are our next ancient elders, right? Then come the plant medicines, and finally our animal relations, and then us. And that's ubiquitous. All over the world, there's an acknowledgement that we are the last to be created. Therefore, we are not the zenith and pinnacle of creation. Quite the contrary. Being the youngest, we have the most to learn, and we look to our elders, which is why those sacred elementals and the fungi and the plant medicines and our animal relations are the elders that we look to and seek counsel from in order to learn how to heal and live in balance.
Thank you.
And so, sorry, just to finish with that, right? So that requires a direct, intimate cultivation of a relationship with them, right? So that's why I believe that any facilitator, whether within a therapeutic context, a medical context, or a medicine person, right? I know absolutely no medicine people who would ever imagine administering sacraments without sitting with that medicine for years upon years and receiving the blessing and the sanction of their medicine teachers, elders, and in many cases, nations.
And yet that is not an opportunity that the great majority of facilitators have to study, with indigenous elders that can convey all of this information. And one of the ways that I'm seeing some of these challenges are people that are, like myself. I have partially trained in different traditions, not ever fully in an apprenticeship with an indigenous elder in a particular medicine tradition. So I've never had that opportunity. And it feels, it's been something that for me has been a challenging hurdle to overcome, because I never felt that I had the permission from indigenous elders to facilitate in a particular way, which led to me choosing one particular medicine that I developed a deep relationship with. And that was not held, I work primarily with mushrooms. That was not held, it was held by my ancestors, in the Mayan tradition, but that tradition has been lost. The only tradition that I know of that is still holding it is the Mazatec tradition, and then in Siberia and the Sami people that still hold those traditions, none of which I was able to apprenticeship with. So how do people like me that have really good intentions, that have good grounding on the principles of respecting indigenous tradition, but don't have the opportunity, how can we pursue a path with integrity? What's your advice?
Well, speaking with myself as a traditionalist, I think it's personally never too late.
Mhm.
And so, in addition to the Mazatecs that you mentioned, actually there are Mayan practitioners that are using the sacred mushroom. In addition to the Sami people, as you mentioned, up in Scandinavia, as well as the Pacific Northwest coast. Right, so they actually have a ceremonial tradition as well that I'm familiar with. Now that said, as I mentioned earlier, indigenous medicine people are really opening up the teachings and making it available for people. Many of the elders and medicine people I encountered at some of these conferences, the psychedelic therapy conferences, are very open and generous and welcoming, right? To have people participate in their ceremonies. So we're out there, right? But it does require a degree of active seeking and listening, right? And no, it's not, and I don't believe that there are accidents. So therefore, if your path encounters a medicine person, right, then there may be doors that can open. But of course, one also has to show one's sincerity, and this is also important, right? So if you're coming from an intent to appropriate, right, or just to take without any reciprocity, chances are, the medicine people may be a little wary, of your agenda or your intentions. But if you really come with an open heart and a sincerity and a willingness to learn, then you'll find, and your listeners will find that they are quite generous and willing to share, right? And of course, therefore, it's going to require patience and time, right? Because not only are you building a relationship with the sacrament, you're also building a relationship with the medicine person who's administering this medicine, right? And over time, like in my situation, I just continued to show up and serve. That's the most important thing, right? That not only do you participate, right? So it's not about just showing up for the ceremony and departing, right? Which again is a consumptive model. Well, rather than we want to begin to cultivate a collaborative or cooperative model. In this case, one shows up to serve. Right? So you're there from the commencement of the ceremony, chopping wood, carrying water. You're showing the elders and the medicine people your sincerity to participate, to let your work be your worship in terms of the support of the prayer that is being offered, by the sponsor, by the medicine person who is and his, her, or their family that is conducting the ceremony, right? And then once the ceremony is complete, then you remain to clean up, to make sure that everything is immaculate afterward, right? So that's actually something that I teach my students and my apprentices, right? That we show up early for ceremony and we remain late, right? Because the elders and the medicine people are constantly observing and watching the participants, right? They know who is coming to take and others who are willing just to give, right? And so fundamentally, that's the model also of reciprocity, right? It's also the love and the energy and the intention that you bring to the ceremony that you're able to participate in. We're talking about, the establishment of selfless service and sacrifice, right? These medicines are sacrificing for us. And it's important that we also learn how to sacrifice as well, right? How to give back energetically, right? And all the elements of the ceremony, everything that you are requested to do or perform, right, in the preparation of the space leading up to the ceremony is a part of the prayer, right? All of that work is a part of the medicine, right? Because the spirit of the plant is watching you as well, right? The ancestors who are present for the ceremony, as I mentioned, that create the container, are watching you. right? And so we're completely vulnerable in that space, right? We're being seen. The fire that's often in the ceremony registers everything that happens, right? That elder is also watching us and is observing very keenly what is transpiring, right? Can track our thoughts and our actions, right? What we carry in our hearts. So it's really important that we conduct ourselves well in ceremony. And that only comes from being able to participate on a regular basis. And it is available, right? It may require, I mean, it's not going to be necessarily advertised, right? However, it is available. And so it's about keeping one's ear, to the ground, to the earth, so to speak, right? Paying attention and knowing who your alliances are. You spoke about alliances, right? So, for example, your invitation for me to share with you today, right, is a doorway. It's an opening, not only for you, but for any of our listeners or people observing this podcast. Right?
Yeah, thank you. One thing that I've always wondered about is as we in the modern application of all of the ceremonial techniques, oftentimes people have learned from a particular tradition and are in deep integrity honoring that particular tradition that they learned. But that may be, say, for example, an ayahuasca tradition, and they're applying the same techniques to working with mushrooms or iboga.
Yeah.
Or they may be opening the space in the way that people in Bolivia may do it, but they are opening the space in the northern hemisphere where the energies of the directions may be different. Talk to me about that. I've always been curious as to what's appropriate, what we need to, as when we're enacting ceremony, what considerations do we need to have about the traditions mixing among ceremonies and locations?
So because of the potencies of these medicines, I've actually heard that people are mixing medicines all in the same night, which is extraordinarily problematic because each one is a ceremony in and of itself, right? And in terms of harm reduction, that's problematic, right? I've been asked to intervene and on several people's behalves because they were injured, emotionally, energetically, spiritually, as a consequence of individuals who are not qualified to administer these medicines were mixing these medicines together, right? So I know many colleagues who are very clear that we don't even mix the songs, right? So an ayahuasca song from grandmother is not appropriate to sing in a grandfather ceremony with peyote. Whole different energy, right? And people endeavor to sing those songs, right? You can actually feel the shift, right? And that goes for any of the songs, right? So therefore we have to be respectful of the energetic lineages of how these sacraments have been brought into existence, right? The listening that took place thousands of years ago, the songs that are specific to each sacrament, right? So in Gabon, they're not going to be singing Native American church songs. They're going to be singing, the Bwiti are going to sing the songs that medicine has requested of them, right? When people sit in the Native American church, sometimes grandfather will share a song, but there are specific nuances and words, regardless of tribe, right, that identify it as a Native American church song, right, a peyote song, for example, right? And so, again, we cultivate that sensitivity, and so we can really feel energetically when there's a song that isn't appropriate for the ceremony, right? And the same is true even like with the Purification Lodge. In Lakota, we call it inipi, right? It's known as a sweat in Western terminology, right? There are specific songs for that ceremony as well, right? And so we want to make sure that we are honoring each lineage, right? And so, the mixing of songs and things can be very, can create a unsafe container, right? Can be very chaotic as a consequence of that. So again, I encourage, our listeners to cultivate vigilance, right? And not just, learn one song from this sacrament and another, and then try to incorporate them together, right? That kind of creates that confusion, right? Rather than a coherence, in terms of how that ceremony is performed, right? Similarly with what's known as the Wiwang Wachipelo, the sacred sun dance, for example. There are specific songs that are sung for that entire ceremony, right? And they may have variations based on nation, but each of those songs are specific for the sun dance, right? Mm-hmm. And so we're not singing songs outside of that context during the ceremony, right? That wouldn't be appropriate or respectful. Mm-hmm. And so I understand the challenges that, therapists and facilitators are encountering, right? And how can, that particular cohort of people, right, given the permissions, if you will, from the Western perspective, how can they dance gingerly, right? I understand the challenges that you're encountering. However, I believe that it's possible to find a balance, right? To find a way whereby, even the simple solution of collaboration, right? So there's going to be individuals within the Western contemporary world that will never step into a ceremony, traditional ceremony, because these ceremonies are challenging. Many of them are all-night ceremonies, like the Native American church. It's an all-night ceremony. Ayahuasca ceremonies, also a very significant duration, right? And there are individuals that will never step foot into a ceremony, right? And so that's why I'm speaking with you, because I understand that there is merit to the administration of what I prefer to say, the psychedelics, right? So those that can be manufactured, right? I would have, if you're going to employ a sacrament, it's important that indigenous peoples are present. That would be my solution, right? That they are, because of their years and years of training, that they are present to invoke that container so the therapists can do their work, right? So it becomes a collaborative endeavor, right? With the use of, shall we say, molecules that have been manufactured, right? There may be a way for indigenous people to support, that exploration with that client, right? And support the therapist in, shall we say, enacting certain guidelines, right? And this is the, I kind of like trying to pull it all back together again. As I mentioned earlier, I think the therapeutic community is still kind of flying by the seat of their pants a little bit. There's no standard uniformity when it comes to guidelines, right? Everyone seems to be doing their own. Now, maybe that's changed since I was last there, but I think that's really the important piece here, is that there's some uniformity of guidelines, right? Which could allow indigenous people's influence, right? So Indigenous people can be consulted for a series of guidelines to be established that could be universal, right? And I understand it's a tall order, but nevertheless, I think it's necessary, right? And that way, they're part of Indigenous people are part of the conversation, creating guidelines that then can be applied in a therapeutic context, for those that, for clients that will never step foot into a traditional ceremony.
Mhm. Mhm. If you were to give advice to someone considering embarking on the medicine path, because they feel a deep calling to it, what would be your advice as to how to move forward?
Wonderful question. So this goes back to intent. And so I would put out a prayer. I would put out an intention to ask the universe to provide doorways to open for them to encounter medicine people, right? Also the dreams to become specific about the sacrament, because it's certainly a lifetime of work if you're going to be cultivating relationships with multiple sacraments and multiple ceremonies, right? And oftentimes I know medicine people who require devotion, to themselves, right? So if you're going to be called, it's hard, again, the Western paradigm of education is kind of based on a smorgasbord of influence, if you will. You'll have multiple mentors and different academic disciplines or classes, for example, right? Well, when it comes to medicine ways, when it comes to the martial arts, it's very different. You're going to accept a mentor, and you're going to take that mentor, or the mentor is going to take you through a journey of years, right? To become a black belt requires about 10 years of tutelage and apprenticeship as well, right? So again, with medicine ways, it's the same, right? There's going to be a devotion to a particular mentor rather than multiple mentors, because it's difficult to serve more than one altar simultaneously. And it will take you years to cultivate that relationship, to understand the songs, the procedures, the protocols ceremonially. And so, once you have the dream or you have an inclination about a particular sacrament, right, then comes the listening, opening up the doorways, inquiries to try to find an individual, right? And so maybe you do encounter a medicine person who is administering this sacrament, right? Then you sit with that individual, you spend time with that individual, you get to know that mentor, and then you'll be able to resonate and feel whether or not you want to embark into a tutelary apprenticeship with them, right? And so you're going to do your own personal vetting of this individual to make sure, that they're trained and they're qualified, that they receive the blessing and the sanction from their mentors and elders and teachers, right? And similarly, the medicine person is going to vet you as well, right? To determine whether or not you'll be devoted, right? That you'll be disciplined to be able to eventually pick up the mantle of responsibility and carry this forward into the future. So that would be my suggestion and my counsel on how to, walk in a good way, right? You spoke about the title of your podcast is about being right with the medicine, right? So that rightness has to do with respect, humility, patience. It also has to do with reciprocity, right? Being right also has to do not with righteousness or wrongness, right? But making sure that there is that respect, right? So.
Mhm. We're approaching our time and I want to be respectful, but is there anything else that you would like to share or anything else you would like to say? How can people get in touch with you? How can people find your website?
Certainly. Well, I am celebrating my 30th year anniversary with my institute. which is Ancestral Voice Institute for Indigenous Lifeways. Our phone number is 415-310-0981. Our email is Phillip with 2 L's at ancestralvoice.org. We also have a website, ancestralvoice.org, as well as a Facebook page and Instagram, which is Ancestral Voice 1. And, my families, my traditional full-blood families, of whom I've been adopted for, decades now, they sacrificed a lot to ensure that these ceremonies could be preserved in perpetuity. And all of them were under the understanding of generosity and opening up these teachings to all human beings. And so I have what is known as an open altar. I call it a teaching hospital. And so everyone is welcome to come and pray and participate and to heal. And this was the mandate of my medicine teachers, my elders, and my families. And so I invite our listeners and our onlookers to come and pray with myself and my families, and to, at this time, feel connection. Right? I think that is what is often lacking in our Western world, is this sense of alienation and isolation and separation. But the beauty of ceremony is that it's unification. It's predicated on love and togetherness and community and cooperation and collaboration, respect, elevating people, helping them to heal from the wounds of the past, right? Not only from our own personal past, but from our familial past, from our intergenerational wounding, right? And that's the beauty and the potency of these ceremonies, and for me, it's really about reaching across the aisle, and for us as therapists and facilitators and traditional medicine people to collaborate and working together in solidarity to be instruments in the relief of suffering in this world.
Thank you so much for that beautiful prayer and that beautiful wish for the healing of all humanity. And I want to thank you so much for your time and for your wisdom and for being willing to share that with others, and for the amazing work that you have been doing now for 30 years. So thank you for coming on the podcast, and I will talk to you soon.
It's a deep pleasure. And again, I celebrate the inauguration of your new podcast. And thank you for allowing me to be your first guest.
Thank you so much, Philip. Take care.
Aho, matakuya asin.